especially when you're a young lawyer, you do not really have time to run around to a bunch of conferences, to sit through a bunch of lectures, because the pressure to bill and to be working is so high that to do all that stuff basically means you're cutting out family and friends and any sort of small amount of free time that you have to go do these extra professional things.
Brent Nelson, welcome to the You Are a Lawyer podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Of course, of course. So you and I met on Twitter. It's one of my favorite places to meet lawyers. I think people really underestimate it. And so let's talk about Twitter. Do you spend time?
I'm of the same opinion, by the way. Just
okay,
so
great.
nobody is confused whether we're on the same page here. It's not going to be a debate about that.
Okay. All right, cool. So what do you use Twitter for? Do you use it because you're a podcaster? Do you use it to just see what people are talking about, or what?
Yeah, it's a little bit of all of it. So I actually find that Twitter is a quite handy place to go to get information. It's almost like a news feed for me on topics that are relevant to what I do for a living. So I follow a bunch of people that sort of are in my space, and that's the majority of my Twitter feed. So my practice is a lot of tax and personal wealth and trusts. And so I follow a lot of people that do that sort of nerdy stuff. And actually, oftentimes, when there's something new that comes out, say like a new tax bill or a new court case or something, I frequently see it on Twitter before I see it on the aggregators that I get through the legal research sites, like your Westlaw's or your Bloomberg Tax or something like that. It's kind of amazing. Mm-hmm. And so those more traditional aggregator sites are almost always behind in terms of the timing of information from what I get from Twitter. So I use it a lot for that. And then I use it to communicate with other people sort of in my space. I do have a podcast, Wealth and Law podcast. And so I use it to communicate with people about that, to share episodes, from time to time to source people that I might want to have on as a guest on the episodes. And it's a pretty fertile place to go, really, mm-hmm. because it really filters down people. Once you have your interests aligned and followed, it really does filter people down to like the people who are most active and kind of most engaged on the topics that are important to you. And so in my case, it's professional, but then also for the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Twitter is definitely one of those hidden gems, which sounds ironic, right? Because everyone's heard of it, but I think mm-hmm. a lot of people, they don't use it the way that you and I are using it. Right. I decided I wanted to record season 7 before season 6 ends. And so I put out a tweet and I was like, hey, I'm looking for 16 guests. I've already have 7. Who wants to talk to me? And I got 4 people in a day. People were like, hey, what about me? Wow. What about me? Oh, someone sent this to me. And I was like, oh, great. But like Twitter's funny. Well, all social media is funny because it'll show, 10 people looked at this, but those 10 people shared it. So
I also find Twitter, I do a lot on LinkedIn as well. And I actually think LinkedIn is an excellent platform. And I have far more connections through LinkedIn than I do on Twitter. But what I find with Twitter is I get more reach on things that I post on Twitter than I have followers, or at least proportionate to the followers that I have on Twitter versus the reach that I get on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I think I get decent reach in LinkedIn, but just as a proportionate follower to kind of, impression, so to speak. Twitter actually is better for mm-hmm. me than LinkedIn in a weird way.
Yeah. And I think it's because you and I, we both are talking about the law, but we're talking about the law and something else, right? I'm talking about the law and careers or interest. You're talking about the law and wealth. So,
right.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit broader. So, okay, Twitter did not pay me for all of this.
And me neither. I wish.
I just wanted to mention that because I do think it's really cool that you and I have connected on Twitter. So, Brent, you mentioned your podcast, the Wealth and Law podcast. Will you tell the audience why you created that and what you talk about on that show?
Well, I created it for a few reasons. The primary reason was that I would sit through a lot of like state bar meetings and professional organization meetings. And the topic would almost always turn to something along these lines. Maybe not exactly these words, but I'm paraphrasing. How do we get these young people to be engaged and to be trained up so they can do this thing that we do that we think is so amazing? And they would come up with all sorts of ideas. There'd be like a boot camp or something. And I would always raise my hand and say, well, yeah, sure, do all those things, but it has to be free. And it has to be easily accessible, because especially when you're a young lawyer, you do not really have time to run around to a bunch of conferences, to sit through a bunch of lectures, because the pressure to bill and to be working is so high that to do all that stuff basically means you're cutting out family and friends and any sort of small amount of free time that you have to go do these extra professional things. And then what I could see was that in a lot of senses for my area of practice, if you wanted to get good information, it was almost exclusively behind a wall, a membership wall, that if you were in, you got it. If you were out, forget it. Or it was behind a paywall.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, why not, in essence, do that content for free and then just put it out so people have access to it, including all of these young people that we're always talking around saying we need to educate. And so I started doing that. And then when I was thinking about how do I format this, because I didn't really want it to be like listening to a lecture. I listened to a few podcasts that are like that, but they're kind of boring. So I thought, well, I go out and have meetings, lunches, coffees, drinks with people in my industry. And inevitably, of course, we'll talk about work and we'll talk about stuff that we're interested in or we're working on, and we'll have great conversations, and sometimes in depth. And I learned a lot from those conversations. I thought that is the podcast.
Yeah.
So it's very informal. Sometimes I have guests on, sometimes I don't, sometimes it's just me. And it's primarily just informal conversations with people who know what they're talking about. And I have found that when you do that, good information comes out, because people know, like they know their material. They don't need to spend hours and days prepping and preparing outlines and PowerPoint slides and all this other stuff that goes into a normal continuing education course. Mm-hmm. So those were kind of my primary motivations. There is a slight selfish part of it.
Okay.
The first selfish part is I'm a bit of a busybody. I like to be busy. My profession is a little bit of an obsession. I will admit it is a little bit of a hobby. And so I very frequently will just kind of have ideas in my head on topics that are relevant to my practice. And I need to get them out. I need some way to get them out. I do a lot of writing and speaking, but what I find with the podcast is it's a really handy way to just get those ideas out of my brain and to do it fast. Because again, you don't when you write and then you edit and you edit and edit and edit. And if you're a lawyer, you edit like 1,000 times because you're too nervous about the wrong comma. And, if you do a presentation, you got to prepare materials and it takes months to plan it. And then you show up and then you get, there's just so much process involved in other forms of getting information out. Whereas with a podcast, it's seamless.
Yeah.
I can hit record a podcast, and within 30 minutes it's posted and it's done. And whatever that idea was that was sometimes keeping me up at night, just rolling around in my head, it's gone, it's out, and I can kind of move on mentally. So I have a little bit of a selfish angle where I'm literally just trying to dump ideas out of my brain so I can remain a functioning human.
I wouldn't say that's selfish. It almost sounds like it's self-care. When you have something on your mind, gotta get milk, so you write it on a piece of paper to stop thinking about it. But for you record it and then you get to move on. So I think that's a wellness tip. Yeah. Yeah,
I wasn't really thinking about podcasting as personal wellness, and I don't think many people would agree, but that it does have that element for me.
Yeah.
Of course, I use the content because of kind of my primary focus of really putting out good information that's helpful to people. Then of course the onus is on me to try to disseminate the information. So that comes in two different fashions. One is having the content to begin with. So doing the podcast regularly enough to have the content so that I can then share it. and then having a big enough catalog where it's meaningful. And then the second part is it means I do need to be active and have active connections through the means and modes that humans use to communicate, which right now is basically social media. So I have to be active on Twitter. I have to be active on LinkedIn to maintain those connections, to feed those algorithms. And then I have the podcast content to help to fill those pipes to keep those connections active so that the information is getting pushed out to the people that I want to have it. Occasionally I get work from the podcast. Honestly, if I never got a phone call from people who listen to the podcast, it really wouldn't matter. I have like a for real law practice. So like I have a day job. So I don't need to monetize the podcast in that way. I think naturally it helps you to maintain connections in this sort of virtual sense that we all maintain connections. And so in that way, it probably helps professionally, but I would see most of those connections anyways. We would meet up for lunch and coffee or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not essential for my practice in that way, but it does help. It helps on that kind of maintaining those relationships side.
Yeah. So when I was preparing for this interview, I was looking at your biography, and you have so many public speaking like appearances. And then when you're not public speaking, you're either being co-chair of an event or you're writing. Would you consider yourself to be a creative person?
I think I would think of myself more as an academic person.
Really? Okay.
And I guess what I mean by that is I appreciate the theory. And I think creative people sometimes do appreciate the theory. It's not always so practical, and everything doesn't have to boil down to dollars and cents, right? And black and white things. So I think in that sense, yes, a true creative who can actually, do nice artwork, no. But certainly an academic person. I just have an academic itch that I have to scratch. And I have a sort of romanticized view of the profession of law, that I view it as a profession first and foremost, which means that what you really are doing, it's a business. It runs on cash. Like there's no question.
Yeah.
But the actual application of it is service to other people and solving other people's problems, whatever it takes to solve those problems. And then doing things that you think will better society through the skills that you have. That's a profession in my mind. And I think inherently being a lawyer is those things, at least from my point of view, totally aside from the actual business side. Like there has to be a business side. And so the writing and the speaking and the conferences and stuff, all of that kind of helps me on fulfilling this romantic idea of the profession that I have.
Okay. So where did you get that romantic idea from? Was it cultivated in law school? Was it cultivated when you started practicing, or what?
It was, a little bit of both, I think, because I've always enjoyed reading and writing and sort of philosophy and theory. These are not practical things.
Yeah.
Like none of these things are practical, but I find them very interesting and, thinking about big thoughts. And so I've always been drawn to that. When I was in law school, they required us to take a federal income tax class. I had no interest whatsoever in tax, but so I was like, I'm going to take it as quickly as possible. That was my first semester of second year.
Yeah.
So I take the basic federal income tax class, and I loved it. And what I loved about it was that it was a topic that, number one, was very practical in some sense, because it was a very specific application of like this dollars and cents things, but also it was so vast that it touched on almost every topic. And in fact, because of its vastness, there's tremendous amounts of vagary. And that vagary piece and that utility piece kind of made me think like, wow, I finally found a thing that takes this love I have of these like weird sort of theories and big picture ideas that are not very helpful to humanity. And it kind of marries it with something that actually can be helpful to humanity. You can still have the one, and you don't have to abandon the one to do the other. And so then I took every tax class I could, and that's all I've ever. I have no other skills. I'm barely a lawyer. I'm not even sure that I could like pass the bar. I don't know anything about criminal law and criminal procedure or constitutional law and all that stuff that you have to know for the bar exam. I have long since forgotten all of that.
Yeah.
And so I have this one skill. But anyways, it developed out of this in law school, being confronted with something that finally seemed to match up a reality of like, you have to have a job that people will pay you to do.
Mm-hmm.
Plus I still have this academic interest of mine, and like, can the two go together? And I found this thing in the law that allowed the two to go together.
Yeah.
So
I think that's for one, it's a really romantic way of discussing tax law. Because like we can hear how excited you are, how passionate you are about it. But I never took like a tax law course. So one of my questions was, how did you get into this practice? So I love that your school made you do it. Now, I'm sure you were in school and in class with people who hated it, right? They just did enough to get through the course. You've actually gone on to practice tax law. You also do estate law and things like that. Do you love the practice as much as you loved learning about it in school?
Yeah, I think I like the practice even better than school.
Okay.
Number one, it's far more lucrative to be in practice than to be sitting in classes, I've learned.
Yeah.
And so that helps. But the reality is that working with clients, because my practice is I think I jokingly told you it's rich people law.
Yes.
So my clients are wealthy families, and about half of those are international families in some fashion, either family or investments here, but they're from abroad, or the reverse, Americans with family or investments abroad. So there's a lot of variety, and I get to interact with all kinds of different people, which is very different from sitting in class in law school, right? Maybe you're reading different cases, and it's interesting with the different characters in the cases, but they're not real humans. And I find in practice, the interaction with the wide variety of people is what keeps it really interesting, because every day is different. Every problem is unique. And that really keeps me interested.
Yeah. So tax law, the very first guest of this podcast was actually an accountant, and she actually had a tax law practice on the side. So I think it's funny. It's taken like 80 episodes to get back to another tax lawyer.
It's not a lot of us.
And definitely not a lot of you that enjoy it to the point where you want to talk about it on a podcast. So
yeah, but can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say though, sorry, not to cut you off there, Kyla, but that even setting aside the taxing, which I know is not for everybody, which is totally fine by me, because that means I will always have a job. It sort of filters, the market down from a purely business perspective, because I am keenly aware of the business side of practicing law too. It filters the market down, but I think any area of the law that someone is interested in or is practicing in, you're almost always best served to become as niched down as you can in niches that have utility. Okay. Yeah. So not just floofy stuff, but like niches that have real utility. So, I do tax law, which is itself basically a specialty within the law. It's a special expertise within the law. Well, it is very, very broad. So no tax attorney knows everything. So then you're already forced into a niche within that niche. And then within that, I really only am working with private individuals. So then it gets niched down even further. And then when I get into the international stuff, it's like, that's another tiny sliver of that tiny sliver.
Yeah.
And it just turns out that in any sort of area of law, when you do that, the practice kind of from a business perspective and developing a practice perspective actually becomes easier. And what I mean by that is again, if you pick something that has utility, it becomes easier, because what happens is that people who maybe in the slightly broader categories are your competitors, in the much narrower category, they become your referral sources. And it has turned out in my career that a lot of my referral sources are actually other lawyers. and other lawyers who do trust and estates work, even though I do trust and estates work.
Yeah.
So because they may have a unique case that has, some international piece that they don't want to touch. So then I get, I get the call from them to handle those cases. Again, even though in everything else being equal, we're basically competitors. And I think every little area of law is that way, which is part of what I think is so interesting about the practice of law, is that when you kind of try to really distill down, like, what does each individual lawyer really care about and find interesting, there probably is some corner in there somewhere, because the law is so vast, that would fill that need.
Yeah. And to just dig a little bit deeper into that, I recently discovered this week, someone explained niche to me in a very, very simple way. And they said it's a targeted audience with a specific intention. So even if you think about your practice, Brent Nelson works with high income international families to, keep them out of tax trouble or ensure that they're, hold on, I have it right here. Okay. Brent Nelson works with high income international families to ensure that they have multi-generational continuity of their resources, right? Something like that. Because I saw in your biography that you were like, that's literally what you do. You create family organizations for multi-generational continuity. And so I think it makes sense that once you have niche down, people would then refer to you, because I feel like the competition is gone. Like literally what you said. It's not, I do estate law, he does estate law, but it's like, he has a specialty here. So of course I would help him out. And then that means if you have a case, you can also then refer someone to. You're like, I thought this was going to be a big international thing. It's not. Now I can send it on if you wanted to, right? So it makes the practice bigger, because now everybody is like working together to say, why don't you just focus on the stuff that you really love? I can do the same thing, and there's enough for all of us to eat, right?
Absolutely. And you're 100% correct in that it goes both ways, right? It filters people coming in, but it filters people going out as well. So now, I know that I don't do real estate stuff, and I have no interest in trying to do real estate stuff. I could tell you what the tax rules are for foreign owners of U.S. real estate, but I'm not going to do your real estate deal. So I already know that, because I have this niche. So when those referrals come to me, I just deflect them off to somebody else. There's not even a question. I think there's a tendency to feel like you need to be full service, and that, while some people can do that, I'm not suggesting that that's impossible. And depending on the size of city that you're in, for example, you could be in a small town where the needs are just such that you have to kind of be a dabbler in lots of different things. But for the most part, when you're a lawyer, you should not be a general practitioner. And so you're already forced into a niche, which means you already have to filter out who's coming in and then who goes out.
Yeah.
And so, the more and more niched you get, the more fine that knife cut is.
Yeah. So Brent, I'm really enjoying this. So we're gonna go a little bit more. How did you decide that you wanted to specifically work with international families? I know you said you do some on the side that's not, all of it is not international, but were you working in tax law and then you were like, I really like these stories. I really like these families. And so you just kind of leaned into it and started to seek out more international families?
It was kind of a combination of things. I had sort of had some extended gap years in college abroad. And so I sort of had that international thing already. And then I was always the youngest person, and nobody knew anything about anything international. And so whenever a case came in that had an international element to it, it ended up on my desk. And so I handled some of those cases and had to just sort of figure out how to do it, which meant I had to do a lot of self-education, and I found them very interesting. And so then I started reading all the articles I could find on the topic, and then I started going to conferences on the topic. And then I started forcing myself to write and speak on the conference or on the topic at conferences. And so it just sort of snowballed from there. And then as soon as the word started getting out that I knew something about this weird little corner of the world, all of a sudden I had a bunch of clients who needed that help because nobody else knew anything about it. So it just sort of, it snowballed on itself, but it really began with, I already kind of had that international thing personally. And then when the cases started hitting my desk, it was interesting. And I just kept digging and digging and digging.
Okay. So to the audience that's listening, because this podcast is all about young lawyers, so either 5 years or less practicing or law students. So I hope what you're hearing is that you will always be learning. Even when you're done with school, you'll always be like, what am I interested in? Or you'll still be digging deeper to say, okay, I have this degree, but now what? Right? It's not like getting your law degree is the final destination. It's literally the launch pad. Okay? Because Brent just told us he's constantly reading and researching and doing his own personal studies so that he could become an expert. So, okay. I love that.
100% agree. 100% agree. I actually don't even know that you can truly practice law without doing it. And I'm constantly learning new things, even in areas that I think I know a lot about. I will still learn new things. One of the habits that I got into early in my career, which is a good habit, and I was told to do, which was good advice, was anytime I would sort of be confronted with a reference to a statute or a case or regulation, that I would stop and go read it. Because I'm doing mostly transactional work, so we're talking about transactional type documents. But if I see a reference to a code section or a regulation section, I stop and I go read it. And still to this day, I will stop and go read sections that I've read 100 times. And half the time when I read them, I'll see something in there that I didn't remember being in there, and I'll learn something new. And I just force myself to do that constantly. That's my personal practice. I think it's excellent practice to really learn an area in depth.
Yeah, I do too. I do that a lot, but I do that with like fiction novels. If someone mentions a book, or like they're like, oh, we got in the car and the song is playing, I'm like, what's that song? So that's a really good practice for you to do while practicing law. That makes a lot of sense. So Brent, there's one thing that's just been running through my head. You live in Arizona, and I don't think of Tucson as being an international city. I don't know why. I just don't. I guess because it's not New York, it's not California. Does your location not necessarily matter when it comes to tax law or, international families and estates?
Yeah, surely it would be easier if I was in New York or LA or San Francisco. I mean, there's just more international money in places like that than where I am, which admittedly is literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rocks and sand and brush and rattlesnakes. So I am fully aware of where I'm geographically located. But what has turned out to be the case is that here in particular, even beyond Tucson, just sort of in Arizona in general, and then I'm licensed in Colorado too. So if you sort of lump Colorado in there, there's a lot of international families from Canada and Mexico. So the plurality of my practice is working with those families. And then beyond that, working with a bunch of other families who are from Latin America. And then beyond them, there's another sliver that's just sort of everywhere. And they usually have some connection here, or they have a connection with somebody that I know. And their issues in the US, they can be state specific, but a lot of times with international families, their issues are actually federal issues.
Yeah.
And so for them, it doesn't matter so much where I am, and we're not going to meet constantly because they live somewhere else. And if we happen to be in the same place, we'll be very glad to meet and go out to dinner and have a nice chat. But for the most part, we communicate virtually because that's what's convenient for them. So they really don't care where I am. I don't really care where they are. And so it works great. So it's quite convenient from that perspective that the clients are so scattered that where I am physically becomes nominal as a consideration.
Okay. And was this the case prior to 2020, or has this developed over the last couple of years?
I think people have gotten more used to communicating virtually, but it was always the case.
Okay.
The biggest difference that's happened since 2020 is I no longer feel like I'm constantly the IT department when we have video conferences. Everybody knows how to do a video conference at this point.
Yeah.
Whereas at the beginning of 2020, yeah, I was the IT department. Before that, I was the IT department.
That's really funny. Okay. So Brent, I just have one last question here for you. What advice would you give to new lawyers or law students about what they can do with their law degree when they are in the practice of law?
Yeah, I mean the world is wide and bright, I think, if you have a law degree. I am not one of the believers, for example, that technology is going to come in and replace lawyers. I think the thing that is the most important if you're going to be a lawyer is developing good relationships with the people who either are the types of clients that you would want, or the people who can connect you to the types of clients that you would want. And I would focus, if I was starting again trying to build a law practice, I would focus all my time and attention on that. And then the one thing that I probably have struggled with the most in my career that's not so good, and so people should do better than me, is just being patient. Because when you're dealing with humans, and that's really what we're dealing with when you're practicing law, whether you're representing corporations or people, those relationships take time. And the sort of fruits of being in those relationships from a private law perspective, it takes time to develop. And so it's far more enjoyable if you don't treat everybody like they're actually a potential client, but just treat them like they're normal humans and just be friends with them. And it will turn out that if you do that, number one, people will like you more because most people don't like to be sold to. And number two, in the end, you'll find what you're looking for, whatever that little niche area is in the law, you'll find it because you will develop these close personal relationships. And so from kind of like a practice development perspective, totally aside from all this stuff we were talking about and digging into the different areas of law and learning it, of course you got to do that, but you've got to have those human relationships. And if you develop those human relationships, it really, in my opinion, doesn't matter what the technology is behind you, because those relationships are the key.
Treat people like people and be patient.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. And I think that makes sense. Because if you're not selling to them, if you're just treating them like a person, if you ask, how are you, and you actually care, that incorporates the be patient, right? You got to wait to see what's going to come out of it. You don't have an angle. I like it. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. And the same goes for being on Twitter. Okay. Treat people like people. Don't sell to people on Twitter. I mean, there's an art to it, but honestly, if you were just actually talking to people and treating them like people, it'll help. So, all right, Brent.
I have a few Twitter pet peeves. I have a few other Twitter pet peeves.
Share it.
One of them is, do not begin anything that you post on Twitter or anywhere else for that matter and say, here is a fill in the blank thing that no one is talking about. And then you post it. Like, I promise you someone's talking about it. And you're probably not so insightful that you are the only person that's ever invented this idea. So don't do that. That won't make you look good on Twitter.
Yeah, definitely not. I see that a lot on LinkedIn too. That's like the worst.
Yeah, LinkedIn's getting that way.
You know, people are like, I didn't have a good day. And you open it, it's like, I had a great day. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a waste of my time. It's like, I didn't know where you were going.
I completely agree with you about Twitter, that you should be patient, just, post, respond, be engaging. You can be nice to people. People will be rude. The more you post and the more that you're out there on social media, of course, people will be rude. Just be nice back. You don't have to be rude back.
Yeah.
If you do that, it'll be a more enjoyable experience.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, that's a life lesson, right? People are rude at the library. People you have no idea what their day was. So just treat people like people and be patient. That might be the title of this episode. Yeah. So, all right, cool. Thank you so much, Brent. You have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.